I am Patti Callahan Henry, and it is my great honor to get to talk to John, as I have been for 3 days, about his books and his adventures and his extraordinary life. There is no way we're going to get to all of it. And I am going to leave time for questions, so if you have something you want to ask. But I want to start here. You have been called so many things, all good things. Adventurer, naturalist, park ranger, writer, wilderness guide, editor, small press editor. What would you call yourself?
A really curious guy.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So before we take a deep dive into the thought, there's John, look at that crazy adventurer, curious guy. I want to talk about your body of work and your origin story, I like to call it. How you became a nature writer, a wilderness expert, and a man of the outdoors. So you say, that's what I'm reading, you say your calling as a writer you found while shooting photographs on expeditions more than 4 decades ago. You've said that you're drawn to the physical challenge and peace you feel in the natural world. And I find that sentence just right. Physical challenge and peace. They might sound opposites, but they do come together. So many people, so many of us out here would give anything to know what their life's work is, and you're embodying it. So tell me when you first knew that this was the thing you wanted to do and this would be your life's work.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was immensely curious, fortunately, even as a teenager. But early on at 16, I pretty much knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to travel the world, and I wanted to challenge myself physically, and I wanted to see what was out there. And right away, as I skipped school and hitchhiked north to the mountains of New Hampshire, I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, I would come back having to explain myself to my peers. Mountain man, they called me. And I felt right away that I had to account for myself. I had to explain myself. And so I started shooting pictures to try to share the beauty of these places that I was going to. And then this evolved very quickly thereafter, reading the works of Rachel Carson, Edward Abbey, to actually serve as a voice for these wild places, which I realized were being exploited and developed and in many cases destroyed. So I had a kind of a dual mission to share these places and to try to save them.
So before we dive deep into the book, I love the question, well, kind of the unanswerable question most of the time, which is, where do ideas come from? It fascinates me. All the authors here, like, it's one of my favorite subjects, like how an idea hits you. And we just heard Patrick talking about they land in his lap, and if he looks hard for them, he can't find them, right? And so what was the idea for Into the Thaw? Is there any way to tell us the first spark of wanting to do this book?
Yeah, the spark really began for this book in 2021 when I took my 15-year-old son to the Arctic, a place I'd been to many times. But I took him to a place in the Arctic that I hadn't visited for more than 35 years. I'd been all around the Arctic, but this particular place on the Nantucket River.
Oh, now I know how to say it.
In the gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska, had radically changed in the more than 3 decades it had been since I visited. And so this trip with my son to share with him the splendors of wilderness became also as much about what's happening to our world. This river is flooding in a way that I never used to see it flood. It's nearly 90 degrees here. When I was here in the last week of August, 36 years before, we wore winter clothing. The bugs are out. We only saw 1 caribou in 100 miles of river, when in my first visit we'd seen thousands and thousands. And that was the genesis for the book. I realized I had to come back and spend a couple of months documenting it more carefully.
which leads exactly into that. The reason this was such a fascinating read for me is that you delve not into just two different timetables of the Arctic, but you also dive into two different timelines of your life because you had your son with you. And as you explore the impact of the warming planet, you are also exploring the changes in you and your son's life as you get out there together. So why is this landscape and was this trip so healing as a father, as a son, as a human?
Well, in one sense, it was a chance to revisit something very important from my past. It was a trip that I did in 1983 as a Park Service ranger. I was sent north from Denali National Park to Gates of the Arctic National Park, and I immediately fell in love with the place. So the trip was healing in the sense that it was returning to something that was very important in my life. But also, I knew that I had to do something. I wanted to take action. I wanted to share with people, with the world, with my readers, that this place is radically changing. Our world is radically changing. And what's going on in the North is not mere climate change, it's a climate crisis.
So on your 8th day of total solitude that you talk about in this, you are kayaking across the Canadian-American border. And forgive me if I say this wrong, I should have asked you this week. 2 Inupiat? I did it. 2 Inupiat boats loaded with caribou meat pull up and you say hello. And then you talk a bit and then they drive off and you say, I burst into tears. And we've talked about this through the last couple days, but you felt that being in solitude like that, being in isolation, being alone in the wilderness, helped you find what you call your intuition. And I have found the same, being alone in the woods, not to that extent, but tell us about what that feels like and how it changed you and that realization after those weeks in solitude.
It was one of the most profound experiences of my life. And it goes without saying that on these journeys that I really shut myself off. I seldom took a satellite phone. Of course, there's not cell phone service in the places I like to go. But it was one of the most profound journeys of my life because I learned, I didn't know exactly what I would find putting myself into this kind of extreme solitude. Of course, there was the challenge of mastery and being able to cope and figuring out how to stay warm and not getting lost. But the profound realization was that after more than a week away from people and from villages, my intuition sharpened in a way that I'd never experienced before. And I began to see the world with newer eyes. I could tell, for instance, when there was wildlife around. A bear stalked me one time, and I hadn't smelled it or seen it, and I just knew I was in the presence of another animal. Remarkably, animals began to approach me because it's as if all the anxieties and angst of the rest of the world in my life dropped away. I had bearded seals swimming alongside me and belugas surfacing. So it was a very once-in-a-lifetime experience.
So for those of you who want, just read the whole book because it's incredible, and the photography in it is blow your mind beautiful. You're seeing some of it up here. But I can tell you the exact page that I underlined it and put it down and just thought about it. And it's what you're that part right there. It's on page 93. And I felt like that moment must in many ways be a before and after in your life. The way you see the world, the way you react with people, the way you intuit things, the way you look at wildlife. Do you see it that way? It felt like that when I was reading it.
Yeah, it really did. It was a watershed moment. Particularly when I met a polar bear at the end of this
That's
long
where I
journey.
was going.
Or for instance, I was sitting out on the end of a long peninsula called the Bathurst Peninsula, and my body was sore. I was battling the wind and the waves for a week and sat down at the end of the sandy peninsula. And in the distance through my binoculars, I watched a wolf chasing a caribou. And it couldn't catch the caribou. There are no trees, so you can see forever, particularly with binoculars. And it gave up the chase, and it must have smelled me a couple of miles away. So I watched it. It took it a half an hour for it to come all the way out to me out on this long peninsula that's jutted out into the Beaufort Sea. And at that point on my journey, I actually carried a gun, but I knew instinctively that the wolf was merely curious. It wasn't coming out for a meal. It was like me. It was curious. It wanted to see what I was doing, who I was. So I pushed the gun away, and the wolf came right up to me and ran a circle around me, and I said, hello. And he just kind of smiled and trotted away to go look for more caribou.
Like John Thornton and Buck in Call of the Wild.
Yes.
That's what it read like to me. Well, as the someone, is averse to danger, you jump and you dive and you run and you swim and you paddle and you go alone and you camp and you camp under the stars without a tent. And when I ask you why you are drawn to such adventure, you keep using, and as many times, and I love it, is the word mastery. So talk to me about why that, or to all of us, about why that is part, beyond curiosity, that is part of your driving force.
I suppose I didn't think about it much at the time, but there's a real joy to be had in trimming your sails well. I was sailing my kayak, for instance, a great deal of the time, which is really a dangerous thing, because if you trim your sail wrong, the wind could catch your sail and throw you into the ice water.
And why? Why do you put it like? I'd be like, then I'm not going. Like, if that's a possibility, I'm not doing it. You know.
But these things come to you after you do them repeatedly and repeatedly, with a sense of intuition and joy. After a while, I no longer thought about that, and it gave me the luxury and the opportunity to become an observer, to observe the wildlife, to wander the land when I couldn't paddle in my kayak, and look for relics out on the land, and really develop a sense of place. And I knew that if I was going to write I knew that I was going to write a book on this particular journey. By being a keen observer, I was able to journal at the end of each day and record my observations.
How long during the alone trip, because you weren't alone the entire time, but how long until you felt like you were in what we might call as writers or artists or in life, how long before you felt like you were in the flow? That you had stopped thinking about checking your email or your phone or people? Like, how long does that take?
Well, in this one particular journey, which I just devote 3 chapters to in this book, I took it in the years 1997 through 1998. I found that I was in a state of nervous anxiety every time I left a village, because I would be leaving the company of these welcoming people, the Inupiat and the Inuit. And it would generally take anywhere from 5 days to 8 days, where the anxieties would just drop off. Yeah. And then I would get into the flow, so to speak, and become a much keener observer. And that's when I began to extraordinarily, in retrospect, have these amazing wildlife encounters. It's almost as if the animals could smell me, that I wasn't a threat.
That's what I was thinking. It was probably a week where things started to fall off. The things you carry, just slowly dropping off. So I love hiking, and I've been up and down very easy mountains. Through the years, as I enter the forest, even with one terrible hiking accident, I still do it. I've come to believe that there's this innate wisdom in the wilds and in the forest, and that some forests and some wilder places are friendlier and more welcoming than others. Am I cuckoo bird?
No, I think that you were probably, listening to that reptilian part of your brain, like I often did, and using your intuition. Yeah. And you might have sensed a mother black bear with a cub. Or you might have known that the terrain ahead was dangerous, or that the weather was going to change. I think we have built-in barometers for that kind of thing. And I think there is some science behind this too. Most of us have ancestors that were hunters who lived out upon the land and developed an instinct for dangers and for where to find food. Yeah. And so you may have been tuned into these things as well.
Like sometimes I'll go in and I'll feel like they're friendly today. Like I'm going to take a longer hike. And other times like they don't really want me here today.
Or else there's a serial killer lurking.
Well, God, don't put that in my head, John. God, I'm never hiking again. Okay. Which leads me to another thing I think the wilds bring us to, and I can tell by being around you, is a certain humility. To go back to Woodward, I don't think one can be in the wild and have the demon of pomposity carrying around with them. You'll be in big trouble. So you finished your solo journey in '99, and you had spoken to an Inuit elder who raised his voice in concern when you asked about the polar bear. And he calls it the one who gives power. And I told you I thought that would be a great book title for you, One Who Gives Power. Tell us about that experience and that polar bear.
Well, in that particular 2,000-mile journey, mostly alone, there are many things that I want to accomplish, but call me crazy, but one of the things I was interested in doing was encountering a polar bear, because I'd seen them in zoos, but I'd never seen them in the wild, only from a great distance. And the Inuit refer to the northern Inuit refer to the polar bear as Tnursak, which literally translated means the one who gives power. And the Inuit traditionally had been animists who believed that all animals have souls. But the polar bear was a special being as the one who gives power. And it had the ability to fly into the sky and fly through the stars into the afterworld. And to have an encounter with a polar bear, whether you were defending yourself or in some cases these people had to kill a polar bear, or just a close encounter, was an experience of power that you would take with you for the rest of your life. So to fast forward that story about the polar bear, I had seen a couple at a distance near the end of my journey, and it was disconcerting, to say the least, to see them. At one point, I watched a polar bear swimming toward me from a couple of hundred yards away, and then it disappeared. And they have the ability to swim remarkably well. They can swim underwater. They're marine mammals. And I'd never paddled so hard in my life, and looking for that polar bear to surface, but it did not. And then I stopped in a village. I was sick. I had bronchitis. I spent several days there talking to the elders, getting to know them, getting to know more about their culture. And that's when the man told me that if I see a polar bear, I should not show it my gun, because essentially showing it your gun is an act of aggression. To fast forward further on, I continued my journey, hoping to reach the far-off village of Pelly Bay. And I got out into the Atlantic tides, so I'd made it all the way from the Pacific to the Atlantic tides, in 2,000 miles. And I was feeling concerned about reaching Pelly Bay. So I didn't know if it was safe to continue, and I was trying to make a wise decision. And I came around a long point, and as I turned the corner close to the land, there was some fast sea ice along the shore, and suddenly a polar bear jumped off a floe. The polar bear was eating a seal and began swimming after me. It was very close, within 50 yards. And I did the wrong thing that we would probably all do. I just began paddling away from it as fast as I could. And that was the wrong thing because I was signaling myself to be a prey species. And I knew within about 10 paddle strokes that I wasn't going to win this race. And my gun was buried in the kayak, and what did it matter? Because if I showed it the gun, I would be in trouble too. So instinctively, I did the right thing. I spun my kayak around to face the polar bear and tried to simply send it all of my respect. And the polar bear stopped swimming after me. And there's a moment, which I'll never forget, of silent communication with that polar bear. We regarded one another. And then it turned around and clambered back onto its flow. She understood that I wasn't competition for that seal she was eating. And I gave the polar bear a great bow, the one who gives power. And I turned around, and that was the end of my journey.
Oh, it's amazing. I've read it. I've heard you talk about it. I still get head-to-toe chills. So I'm going to go to the cover of the book for a second. It'll flash up, but it's called a thermokarst. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Tell us about that and why it's on the cover. Because I've heard numerous people this weekend comment to you what a gorgeous cover it is. So tell us about that.
Yeah, well, across the circumpolar Arctic now, the Arctic is in a state of climate crisis. It's warmed nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. And of course, everyone knows about the sea ice diminishing. And as the sea ice diminishing, the ocean takes on the heat, and the heat hits the land. And the land in all of the Arctic around the world is underlain by permafrost. Sometimes it's a solid ice, sometimes it's simply frozen soil. And that permafrost is collapsing. And on flat ground, there are thousands across the Arctic now of what look like sinkholes. And these are very recent occurrences, just in the last couple of decades. And on more sloped terrain or mountainsides, you see what look like landslides. They always have a distinctive shape to them. And those are called thermokarst too. The earth is literally thawing, and all this mud and silt are being sent into the watersheds. So it's just one of many fascinating yet scary phenomenon that are occurring across the north right now. And of course, these thermokarsts, as that permafrost thaws, it's releasing carbon dioxides into the atmosphere along with a more potent greenhouse gas, methane.
It is a visual image of climate crisis, is what it is, like showing us what it looks like instead of it being a vague idea in our mind of what is happening to the earth and to the land and to the atmosphere when you learn what a thermokarst really is. So you point out that the Nantucket Valley, where you went, is considered an inhabited wilderness, not uninhabited, inhabited wilderness. To me, the word wilderness means uninhabited, except by, things that can eat me, like a polar bear or serial killer, that too. But what does that mean, an inhabited wilderness?
Well, wilderness has a very different meaning in the north, particularly in the far north, because there are people that have lived on the land for thousands of years, and they still go out on the land. And even in legislated wilderness areas, for instance, in Alaska, the Inupiat people, the Yupik or Athabascan people go out upon the land and hunt and interact with the earth, commune with the animals, or find their foods, their veritable food security through the animals by hunting. So it has a very different meaning up north. And you can find the remnants of these people scattered across the landscape. They now have moved principally into their villages. They used to be a nomadic people, but now, it still, to us, to me, is very, very much intact wildernesses that are changing because they're thawing, but you can go for weeks without seeing another person.
So I have so much I want to talk about that I won't get to, so I'm kind of flipping through, but I do want to talk about this a lot because eventually, after being in the wilderness, and we've talked a lot about isolation, solitude, seeing what you're seeing, you are directed to Hilda and Thurston Booth's house. Look, I made you smile. Where you were greeted like an old friend. And this is where your trip changed from wilderness travel to learning about the climate crisis and those most affected by it. Take it from there.
Yeah, well, I refer to this as a climate crisis rather than climate change, not only because of the changes and the damages to the landscape and to the wildlife, but to the culture, because there are, on the roof of America, there are 260,000 people who live there. In Alaska, that includes about 60,000 people.
Explain what you mean by roof, to explain to them what you mean.
Within the Arctic Circle, when you go to the land, basically most of it's above the trees, the land of the permafrost. And these people are having to make very radical adaptations. If they haven't built their houses on jacks, their houses are going all cattywampus as they're literally being sucked into the ground as the permafrost thaws. The roads and airstrips are broken up by the permafrost. The rivers are flooding in ways they've never flooded historically. The sea ice is diminishing, and the sea ice is acts as their safe highways in the wintertime, and in the summertime it protects their villages from storm erosion and inundation. So it's an incredibly quickly changing world for these people. And I might add that they are the most noble and generous people I've ever met. They repeatedly took me in and fed me and talked to me at length. Of course, they wanted to talk about the changes, and they understood the changes as well as any scientist.
At this point, when I'm reading, I feel like we're on a journey with Odette. I expect you to meet the sirens. Like, you hit the polar bear and the indigenous people, and then the storms, and you come out on the other side and return home with all this insight. So before I open it up, I'm going to ask what I think a lot of you are thinking. How many life and death situations have you been in? And which is the polar bear probably what you would call your closest call? And the second part of that is, even with all those life and death, because you've been in search and rescue, on Denali, what makes you return even after these experiences?
Well, what to me, what to one person would constitute a life and death experience, to me might be a different thing. Because I'm accustomed to figuring out quickly how to minimize risks in situations. And the polar bear, to me, was an amazing, once-in-a-lifetime experience. And in retrospect, I didn't feel my life was in danger because I knew how to do the right thing. But there were many other instances on various trips in the Arctic where I did the wrong thing. I was camped on a tiny island one night in the middle of the Canadian Arctic. I hadn't seen people for more than 2 weeks, and I was sailing my kayak that day because there was a wind, and before I left camp, I stopped to pee and forgotten that I had engaged my sail on the kayak, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the kayak sailing away.
Oh, God. Oh.
And without thinking, I just jumped into the water and began swimming after it. And unfortunately, I caught it. So to me, that was a boneheaded mistake that could have killed me. And I had a few of those mistakes. Another time, sailing off nearly a mile offshore, my kayak capsized because I didn't correctly anticipate the wind, extreme gusts of wind. And I was in a place called the Smoking Hills, which any other place in the world would be a great national park because the hills are on fire. There's coal underneath the ground, sending up these great plumes of smoke. And my kayak capsized because I didn't have the outriggers on, because I was in too much of a hurry to put them on because the mosquitoes were so bad. And I was far offshore, as I mentioned, went into the water, ice cold, and I know that I've got very little time to get to shore because I'm going to go hypothermic. And fortunately, I started swimming the kayak to shore. I couldn't roll it because it was too overloaded with gear, and began swimming it towards shore. And fortunately, my feet, it was a long, shallow shelf, and I was able to sort of run in first chest deep and then waist deep and then knee deep water. And I got to shore beyond shivering. And you'll recall that I'm in the Smoking Hills, and I happened to come ashore right at a big fumarole of hot smoke coming into the air. I stripped off my clothes, was barely able to get them off because my fingers were so stiff, and stood naked over this fumarole to warm myself up.
See, it welcomed you. That's what I mean. Like sometimes the forest helps you or the wilderness helps you.
Well, in that case, someone was looking after me.
Yeah. They were like, oh, he's usually not so boneheaded. We're gonna give him a hand this time. Okay, I am.
That day after I left there, I counted, I kid you not, 19 brown bears, very hungry grizzly bears. And I paddled over to one of them to say, hello, Mr. Bear, and which I always did when I saw a bear.
Like, hi, bear.
And the bear stood up, about 8 feet tall, like this, and without a second thought, just walked right out into the water and began swimming after me. But fortunately, grizzlies are very lumberous swimmers. So
it was like, oh, a little snack for me.
Yes, I set the world record paddling speed.
No one was there to witness it but the grizzly. Here, you can have, I hate giving up microphones, but you can have mine. Here you go. We're going to open it up for some questions. Does anybody have a question? Because I have a lot more if nobody has a question. Anybody have anything they want to ask about? Oh, over here. Okay.
At this point in the trip, I had a para-wing, and I had my dog with me to cover more miles effortlessly.
You mentioned your photographer, Chris. He was there too.
Yes, at some portions of my journey, Chris was there.
I have a question about your writing and the language that you use to describe the climate crisis, and how, over the course of your career, how that's had to evolve with the urgency of the crisis, and how you, the challenges of writing to convey that urgency, and the challenges of finding the stories and the narratives and the words to actually get the urgency to penetrate when people seem to not be listening?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the best ways, I don't know that I can speak so much to craft because that's more complicated, but one of the best ways to speak to the urgency of the issue is through the people themselves who have experienced it. And as I mentioned, I kept journals, and to write this most recent book, I went through my journals and found something that I'd nearly forgotten about. In 1997, an Inuit man who lived out in the Canadian archipelago on Banks Island told me, he was 70 years old, but he told me that they used to have sled dog races every 4th of July. And in the last decade, beginning in the 90s, they could no longer have sled dog races because there wasn't any snow. It had melted. Or that there weren't mosquitoes in their villages until recently, and that there were bluebirds and robins coming to their village, as well as red salmon and king salmon, which historically have never happened in the Arctic. So I found that one of the best ways to, I believe, to convey the urgency of the crisis in the Arctic is to listen to the people and share their stories, and they're eager to tell them. And of course, I think through photography as well. For instance, the cover of my book, as Patti was saying, features this giant scar upon the land known as a thermokarst.
John, some 40 years plus ago, you taught me to expedition climb. And in that first climb, I experienced a number of things. You were a mountain executive of great competence 40 years ago. And at the same time, in that climb, you both threatened me and saved my life. And in terms of it, for which I'm grateful. John, I want to know how you define courage. and particularly yours, in the extreme and isolated environments?
Well, one aspect of courage was telling the mother of my 15-year-old that I was going to take him into the Arctic. And that I wasn't going to kill him. Just like I insisted to Lisa, your wife, that I wasn't going to kill you on our first trip. It's a great question, and I'm scrabbling for an answer. What I land upon is that I think that when you're selfless and you're with a team, when you're with other people, real courage is about taking care of the other people and forsaking your own needs.
How about when you're alone?
When you're alone, real courage is, and it's a fine line between real courage and brazen stupidity as to whether you should sail on a day where there's an amazing sailing wind, but the surf is 5 feet high, and you know you're 200 miles from the next village, and if you blow it, you're dead. So real courage is not only making the right decision, but going for it.
So I once, one of my favorite philosophers, it's not a poet, John O'Donohue, has this phrase, to be courageous in my terrors. And I've always liked that, even if I can't do it, because I'm sure you have been terrified and then had to somehow find the courage in that terror to do the next thing and not just abandon the mission or the trip, or it'd be a lot easier to just go home. Well, not for you, for me.
Yeah, it's amazing sitting here in this warm room and searching my memories. In retrospect, I think about how those moments where I was terrified, and there were more than a few, and how, in fact, we have the tools, and some of us, I think, are again relying on our ancestors' intuition to go forward. And it's amazing how the terror subsides when you take action and when you show mastery to subdue the fear and the terror.
John, hi, it's Sarah. Hi, Sarah. Hi. First of all, thank you for raising this incredibly important issue of climate crisis. And as I sit here, I am struck by both a sense of wonder and a sense of panic that it is such a crisis and has gotten to such a crisis point. So my question to you is, what can each of us do besides voting for politicians that support policies that preserve and protect our beautiful planet, besides donating to organizations that support that work, and perhaps you could suggest some organizations that are best to do that? What can each of us do to help support and protect our beautiful planet?
Thank you for that essential question, Sarah. In the back of my book, I have an appendix with suggestions. And of course, there are many things that we can do, but I like to suggest that we listen carefully and that we stay abreast of the news and that we learn the science. It's really important to study the science and to be adept at knowing what's true and what's not true. But equally important, I think, we need to have a dialogue with other people. We need to listen to other people that, for instance, might not believe that this is a climate crisis, and talk to them, or at least let them share their viewpoint. And there are many ways that we can be involved in terms of simply figuring out, being clever about reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. All of us can do better. And I created this appendix in my book wherein I share some examples.
Thanks, Sarah.
I should have asked this question before hers, but but my question is, given where you've been and how physically demanding your job is, and also that this is the lunch hour. What is the most astonishing meal you've ever cooked in the most remote place? But it's really a serious question if you think about it, because you get to taste some things that other people don't.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's important to eat what your hosts are eating, because you insult them if you don't, or they think you're a wimp. But I'd have to say that one of the most stunning, and I wouldn't call it a meal, I would call it a taste of a whale, because I think whales are remarkable animals. They swam next to me a great deal of the time. But the people have never accounted for the eradication of any of the species they share the North with. But they also believe that they share the same souls of these animals, or at least they did historically. And muktuk, which is whale blubber, is one of their sought-after delicacies. And the first time I ate muktuk, I was on a peninsula in the Yukon Territories. And it was a hunting camp, actually. And I'd been told not to go there because it's an Inuit hunting camp. But I was alone and in a kayak, and they welcomed me into their hunting camp because they were curious about me. What's a kabluna, a white guy, doing alone in a kayak here? And they happened to get the first whale of the season while I was staying there. And I watched them butcher it up, and there's a great sense of awe and reverence as they butchered up this whale and placed the squares of muktuk and blubber on a drying rack. And then, of course, everyone had a taste of the whale, including me. And I guess it was one of the most extraordinary things that I've ever eaten, because it was a very cold, icy day in July 1997. And I remember not even 10 minutes after I'd eaten that fairly large chunk of muktuk that I had to take my hat off. I felt a flush of heat coming over me. This whale, this muktuk blubber is so rich in omega oils and fats that it just immediately warmed me up. And it was a sort of an insight into the importance of the things they ate and how the food security depended upon these particular animals with a tremendous amount of blubber in them. And then, of course, the next thing that happened 20 minutes later is I felt incredibly sick to my stomach.
They're making us stop, unfortunately. But I would like to say that not only does John write about this and give us these photographs, but he walks the walk. We didn't talk about it because we ran out of time, but he sailed with a group from San Diego to Hawaii, 36 days collecting plastics in the ocean to try and raise awareness. I know. So I would love if you would support him and our climate and the book festival, and run on out there and get his book and get it signed. And John, this has been such an honor. Thank you. And thanks all of you.
Thank you.